The spring morning had been perfect. That was the problem. Michael Chen stood at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the April sun paint gold across his backyard. The lawn had been freshly seeded 3 weeks ago. The new fence, installed just last month at considerable expense, gleamed in the light. He'd spent the entire winter planning this space, sketching out garden beds, researching the best drought-resistant plants for the Arizona heat. This yard was his meditation, his sanctuary, the one place in his chaotic life as a project manager that felt entirely under his control. By 10:47 a.m., that sense of control had evaporated. Michael was in his home office on a video conference call with his development team when he heard it, a bass line so heavy it vibrated through the walls. He muted himself, walked to the window, and felt his stomach drop. The backyard was swarming with people. Not a few neighbors, not a casual gathering. There had to be 30, maybe 40 people in his yard. An inflatable pool, a massive one, at least 12 feet across, sat in the center of his pristine lawn, already filled with water and bodies. Children were running across his newly seeded grass. A folding table laden with beer bottles and snack bowls occupied the space where he'd planned to place his meditation bench. Music thundered from a portable speaker. Someone had strung up blue and white streamers along the fence, his new fence, presumably without permission. Michael's hands went numb. He was still starring when his boss's voice crackled through his headphones. "Chen, you there?" "Yeah," Michael said quietly. "Yeah, I'm here, sorry, I need to reschedule, something's come up." He didn't wait for a response before clicking out of the meeting. The back door was locked. He'd left it that way out of habit, so Michael had to take the long way around through the garage. His heart hammered as he walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. Part of him hoped he was misunderstanding what he was seeing. Maybe it was some kind of neighborhood block party he'd somehow missed an email about. Maybe someone had asked permission and he'd forgotten. He knew that wasn't true. He checked his email obsessively. He would never, ever forget something like that. As he rounded the corner into his backyard, the scene crystallized into undeniable reality. Corinne Whitmore stood at the edge of the inflatable pool in a designer bikini that probably cost more than Michael's monthly car payment, a glass of rosé in one hand, a sun hat in the other. She was laughing at something one of her friends had said, her head thrown back, utterly at ease. That was Corinne's superpower, the ability to make herself comfortable anywhere, with anyone, regardless of whether she belonged. Michael had lived next door to her for 3 years and still couldn't quite explain how someone so flagrantly entitled had become such a fixture in his life. She'd moved into the house to the west of his property after her divorce, immediately establishing herself as the neighborhood matriarch. She hosted wine nights. She organized the HOA meetings. She threw herself into the role of connector, which apparently meant she had a key to everyone's social calendar, but no filter about boundaries. "Michael," Corinne spotted him and waved, as if she'd been expecting him to join her at any moment. "Come on, don't be shy, the water's perfect." Michael's jaw tightened. He walked toward her, hyper-aware of every eye turning in his direction. He could feel the shift in atmosphere. The music didn't stop, but it seemed to get quieter, the laughter a beat more forced. "Corinne," he said when he was close enough to keep his voice level and not shouting, "what is this?" "What does it look like?" She smiled, genuinely pleased with herself. "Pool party. I told everyone your yard had the best view of the mountain, and I thought, why not make use of it? It's such a gorgeous day, and everyone's been so stressed with work and families and everything. I figured we could all use a little." "You told everyone they could have a pool party in my yard," Michael said slowly, "without asking me." "I was going to ask." Corinne's smile faltered, but only slightly. "I was going to text you this morning, but honestly, honey, I knew you'd say no. You're always saying no to things. You're always so stressed about your lawn, your fence, your plans. So I just figured if I showed you how much fun it could be, how it could bring the neighborhood together." "It's my property, Corinne." The words came out quiet, which somehow made them hit harder. For a moment, Corinne's expression shifted. Michael saw something flicker across her face, not remorse exactly, but something like a recalibration. Then her jaw set, and the moment was gone. "You know what, you're right, I should have asked, I'm sorry." She said it the way someone apologizes for stepping on someone's shoe, acknowledging the technical transgression while making clear she didn't really think it mattered. "But we're here now, and everyone's having such a great time. How about we finish up? We'll be done by 2, and then next time I'll make sure to ask." "There is no next time, Corinne. You need to tell people to leave, now." Her eyes narrowed. Excuse me. Pack it up, everyone goes. That pool needs to come out of my yard. The music actually did stop then. Michael became aware of the silence. The background hum of children paused mid-splash, conversations cut short. All those eyes were definitely on him now. Karen set down her wine glass with deliberate slowness, the kind of theatrical gesture that told Michael she was shifting into a different mode. This was Karen in conflict resolution mode, which in Michael's experience meant she was about to explain why her violation of his space was actually his problem. Michael, she said, her voice taking on that patient, almost condescending tone she used when she was about to lecture someone. I understand you're upset, but look around. These are your neighbors. These are people who care about you, who have invited you to their homes, who have tried to include you in the community. And you're going to, what? Tell them all to leave because of some arbitrary rule about your grass. It's not an arbitrary rule. It's called private property. It's called being part of a community, Karen countered, and Michael could see her confidence returning now that she'd framed this as a moral argument rather than a factual one. It's called understanding that we're all connected here, that we should support each other, lift each other up. You can't just... You violated my home, Karen. The word home seemed to land differently than property or yard. Michael saw her flinch slightly. But then one of her friends called out from the pool, Come on, Karen, don't let him ruin the vibe. And someone laughed, a nervous, testing kind of laugh to see which way this would go. Karen's jaw tightened. Michael watched the calculation happen behind her eyes. She'd committed now. She'd made a public stance. Backing down would be losing in front of the audience she'd assembled. You know what? She said, her voice taking on an edge of anger. You're being incredibly selfish. There are children here. There are people who work hard all week and just want a few hours to relax. And instead of being a decent neighbor, a decent human being, you're going to throw a tantrum about some grass. Michael felt something break inside him then. Not dramatically, not with anger or shouting. It was quieter than that, the moment when he stopped trying to reason with her, stopped trying to make her understand. He simply accepted that Karen Whitmore, his neighbor of 3 years, the woman who'd borrowed his garden shears and never returned them, the woman who'd signed him up for neighborhood watch duties without asking, had just made a choice. She'd chosen to take what wasn't hers and defend it, as if her right to fun mattered more than his right to consent. I'm asking you one more time, Michael said quietly. Get everyone out of my yard and get that pool out of here. You have 30 minutes. Or what? Karen's voice had gone cold. You going to call the police on your neighbors, on me? Michael didn't answer. He simply turned and walked back into the house. He could hear her calling after him, something about him being selfish and ungrateful, and this being about something deeper than a pool party. The music started again, louder this time, almost defiantly so. Someone started a chant, "Party, party, party." Michael locked the back door, stood in his kitchen, and tried to steady his breathing. 30 minutes passed, then 40, then an hour. Michael, watching from his office window, saw that no one was leaving. In fact, more people seemed to be arriving. He recognized his neighbor David from 2 streets over, and the Patels who lived on the corner. Karen had apparently texted everyone she knew that there was a free pool party happening, and the community had responded enthusiastically. The violation was no longer something that could be resolved by asking politely. It had metastasized into something bigger, a statement that Karen made and everyone else had apparently agreed to endorse. Michael went to his garage and opened the electrical panel that controlled his sprinkler system. He'd paid extra to install smart controls when he'd had the irrigation system put in last month. The setup covered the entire yard in 8 separate zones, all programmable, all capable of being triggered manually from his phone. He stood there for a long moment, holding his phone, thinking about what came next. This wasn't a small thing. This wasn't just telling people to leave. This was deliberate, calculated, and it would absolutely escalate everything that had already gone wrong. He thought about his meditation bench, still in a box in the garage. He thought about the seeded grass, already being trampled by 40 careless feet. He thought about Karen's assumption that she could take whatever she wanted from his life, and that he'd eventually just accept it because everyone else had. Michael opened the sprinkler app. He selected all 8 zones. He set them to maximum pressure. He hovered his finger over the activation button for exactly 3 seconds, aware that once he did this, They would find out exactly what kind of person he was willing to become. Then he pressed down. The sound was immediate and unmistakable, a series of hydraulic hisses as the underground pipes came alive. The sprinkler heads burst upward through the grass with the force of geysers. In the 45 seconds that Michael allowed the system to run before shutting it down, the sprinklers had transformed his backyard from a party venue into a disaster zone. The inflatable pool, designed for gentle afternoon refreshment, had absorbed the force of 8 converging geysers and was already collapsing like a deflating balloon. The beer bottles had been knocked over in a tsunami of spray. Laptops, phones, and tablets, seemingly brought by people who couldn't even manage to leave technology behind for an afternoon, were being frantically grabbed by their owners as water rained down on them like the opening scene of a biblical plague. The blue and white streamers had been torn from his new fence, fluttering in the wet chaos like failed surrender flags. And Karen stood in the center of it all, her designer bikini and expensive sun hat absolutely soaked, her mouth open in what might have been a scream or might have been just shock at the realization that Michael Chen had actually, genuinely gone through with it. People were running in all directions, toward the side gate, toward the houses bordering his property, anywhere away from the onslaught. Parents were grabbing children, yelling things that were lost in the sound of rushing water. Someone shouted, my phone," in what sounded like genuine anguish. Michael stood in his kitchen, watching through the window, and felt absolutely nothing. That was perhaps the most dangerous part. The absence of satisfaction, the absence of regret, the absence of any emotional response whatsoever. He'd expected to feel something, triumph or guilt or fear. Instead, he felt like he was watching a movie of someone else's life, with only a clinical interest in how it would end. The sprinklers hissed off exactly 45 seconds after they'd activated. The silence that followed was profound. People stood dripping in his yard, their designer clothes plastered to their bodies, their hair hanging in wet strands. Someone was crying. A child, probably, confused and cold and frightened. The inflatable pool had collapsed entirely, creating a small lake of murky water that sloshed as people waded through it. Karen stood motionless, water streaming down her face, and Michael realized with a distant sort of clarity that she was crying too. Not performatively, genuinely. He should have felt worse about that. He knew he should have. But the thing about having a line crossed is that it changes you. Michael had spent 3 years being the polite neighbor, the considerate one, the person who asked permission and respected boundaries. He'd let Karen borrow his ladder. He'd listened to her stories about her divorce. He'd been kind to her. And she'd repaid that kindness by deciding that the rules didn't apply when she wanted something. The doorbell rang. Then rang again, insistently. Michael ignored it, watching instead as people began filing out of his yard. Most of them wouldn't make eye contact with each other, let alone with him through the window. They were already framing this narrative in their heads, he could tell. They were reimagining themselves as victims rather than trespassers, as people who'd been assaulted rather than people who'd invaded. The doorbell rang a third time. Michael, Karen's voice came through the door, high-pitched and furious. Michael, open this door. You could have hurt someone. You're going to hear from my lawyer. He didn't answer. She kept at it for another minute, alternating between demands and threats and pleas. At one point, she was sobbing so hard he could barely understand her. You didn't have to do that. You didn't have to humiliate me like this. Michael went upstairs to his bedroom and closed the door. He lay on his bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling while the sound of Karen's voice filtered up from the front porch. She was still out there, still crying, still demanding that he face her, face what he'd done. His phone buzzed. A text from David, his neighbor from 2 streets over. That was pretty harsh, man. Then another from the Patels. Hope you're happy with yourself. Then a Facebook notification. Someone had already posted a photo. Karen, soaked and crying, with the caption, "This is what I get for trying to bring the community together. Some people would rather destroy than connect." It had 73 likes and 37 comments already. Michael put his phone on silent and continued staring at the ceiling. By evening, his phone had accumulated 127 text messages, and his Facebook had been flooded with variations on the same theme. He was selfish. He was angry. He was the kind of person who let his lawn matter more than community. He was the kind of person who would physically assault his neighbors over a few hours of their company. No one mentioned the fact that he hadn't given permission. No one mentioned that Karen had violated his property without asking. No one seemed to think that part mattered anymore. There was a knock on his door around 8 o'clock. Michael didn't answer. There was another one at 9, same thing. By 10, his phone rang. It was his mother. "Michael, what have you done?" she said without preamble. "Karen called me. She's very upset. Why would you do such a thing?" "Because she threw a party in my yard without asking," Michael said flatly. "She said you were upset about some grass. She said she was trying to help you be part of the community." "She invaded my property, Mom." "She's a lonely woman going through a difficult time," his mother said, with that particular maternal logic that assigned blame to the person who dared to enforce his own boundaries. "You could have been kind. You could have just asked her to leave. Instead, you humiliated her in front of everyone." Michael hung up and turned his phone off entirely. He sat in his dark bedroom and thought about the moment he'd pressed the button. He tried to access some kind of regret, some kind of shame. What he found instead was a crystalline clarity about something he'd been avoiding for a long time. He was angry. Genuinely, profoundly angry, not just at Karen. At his mother, who'd taught him that other people's feelings mattered more than his own boundaries. At the neighborhood, which had collectively decided that a woman's right to have fun took precedence over his right to not be violated. At himself, for ever letting people treat his home like it belonged to them. When he finally turned his phone back on at 11 p.m., there was a voicemail from an unknown number. A woman's clipped, professional voice informed him that she was calling on behalf of Karen Whitmore and that she would be pursuing damages for the destruction of her personal property and the emotional distress he'd caused her. "We're looking at a civil suit," the woman said. "I'd advise you to take this seriously." Michael played the message twice to make sure he'd heard it correctly. Then he opened his email and composed a message to his homeowner's insurance agent, documenting the day's events in clinical detail. The unauthorized entry, the refusal to leave after being asked, his attempt to remove them using his own property systems. He hit send at 11:47 p.m. Outside his window, the neighborhood had gone dark and quiet. His yard was a wreck, wet, collapsed, trampled. The new fence that he'd been so proud of was festooned with the remnants of Karen's streamers. The meditation bench he'd been planning to place in that space seemed like it belonged to a different lifetime. Michael thought about all the people who'd made the same choice Karen had, that their comfort mattered more than his autonomy. And he thought about how, for the first time in his adult life, he'd actually done something about it. It had felt powerful for exactly 45 seconds. Now, in the quiet of his bedroom, it just felt lonely. The next morning brought a text from Karen. "We need to talk about this. I'm willing to work something out." Michael didn't respond. By afternoon, there was an official letter from a law firm citing emotional distress and damage to property. Karen was suing him for $12,000. By evening, a process server had arrived at his door. Michael signed the papers with the same mechanical precision he'd used to activate the sprinklers. The real damage, he was beginning to understand, wasn't what happened in 45 seconds of water and chaos. The neighborhood's response evolved with the kind of organic, almost predictable fury that only happens when people have decided they're the heroes of someone else's story. By the third day after the sprinkler incident, Michael's lawn had become a kind of unofficial community gathering place, not in the way Karen had intended, but as a staging ground for collective judgment. Neighbors would pause on their walks to stare at the damage. People would congregate on the sidewalk outside his property, shaking their heads, occasionally pointing. Someone left a note in his mailbox that said, "You should be ashamed of yourself." He threw it away without reading the rest. The actual lawsuit that Karen had filed turned out to be the least of his problems. Her lawyer, a woman named Patricia Stiles who apparently worked for a firm that specialized in neighbor disputes, sent a series of increasingly aggressive letters. The $12,000 had been recalculated to include professional mold remediation, because, apparently, one of the destroyed laptops had been a MacBook Pro and water damage was a serious issue. Lost wages for Karen's day spa business. She'd been too emotionally devastated to work for 3 days, and something vaguely called emotional damages and public humiliation. The new total was $47,300. Michael's insurance company responded by declining to cover any of it, because technically the sprinkler system was Michael's property and he deliberately activated it. It wasn't a malfunction or an accident. It was intentional destruction, which fell outside the bounds of their coverage. So Michael hired his own lawyer, a tired-looking man named Derek Mitchell who specialized in property disputes, and tried to explain what had happened. "You activated the sprinkler system on purpose," Derek said, reading through his notes, "with knowledge that there were people on your property. They were trespassing. Did you ask them to leave first?" "Of course I did. Karen refused." Derek looked up from his notepad. "And how many of the other 40-some-odd people there did you personally ask?" Michael didn't answer. "Here's the thing," Derek continued, "and I'm going to be direct with you because that's what you're paying me for. The law is complicated here. You had every right to ask them to leave. You absolutely did not have the right to deploy a weapon. And yes, a high-pressure sprinkler system counts as a weapon in this context, against them without warning. The fact that it was your property doesn't give you license to cause harm. I was trying to get them to leave. You were trying to humiliate them, and it worked. But humiliation, unfortunately, costs money in this state, especially when it involves property damage and physical harm." "Did anyone get physically harmed?" Derek sighed. "A woman in your neighborhood claims she slipped and fell on your wet grass and has a sprained wrist. She's already filed a separate claim. There's a child who was scared and is now in therapy. The MacBook I mentioned, it belonged to someone else, but Karen's property damage is real. And Karen herself is claiming some kind of anxiety disorder that's developed since the incident." Michael felt something dark unfurl in his stomach. That's not even close to accurate." "I know, but accurate or not, it's going to be expensive to defend against." Derek leaned back in his chair. "Here's what I'm thinking. You settle with her. You pay some amount that makes this go away. Probably somewhere in the range of $8,000 to $12,000 if we negotiate. It's cheaper than a lawsuit and it ends this." "I'm not giving her money." "Then we fight and it costs you $15,000 in legal fees, plus whatever the judgment ends up being, plus the possibility of a civil verdict that goes against you. Your insurance company is already distancing themselves. You're going to be paying this out of pocket." Michael stood up. "Thank you for your time." "Michael, I didn't do anything wrong, and I'm not paying her for trespassing on my property and then suing me about it." Derek stood too, straightening his papers with the practiced gesture of someone who'd had this conversation many times before. "Be careful. Pride costs a lot more than compromise." Michael left the office and drove home, acutely aware of being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly. Neighbors were legitimately watching him. When he pulled into his driveway, he could see Janet Morales 2 doors down actually standing on her porch, arms crossed, making no pretense of doing anything other than observing him. When he got out of the car, she made a small noise, not quite a laugh, not quite a snort, and went back inside. His mailbox had accumulated 7 new pieces of mail since that morning. 3 were sympathy messages for Karen, accidentally delivered to his address. 2 were addressed to the resident and contained neighborhood meeting minutes from before he'd moved in, apparently intentionally sent to make some point he didn't understand. 1 was a package that, when he opened it, contained a bottle of chamomile tea and a note that said, "Maybe this will help you relax and think about others more often." The 7th was from the HOA, informing him that his property was in violation of several neighborhood standards. His lawn, the letter stated, was in poor condition, yes, because people had thrown a pool party on it. His fence had damage, yes, from Karen streamers. His property generally presented a negative appearance, subjective, but okay. He had 30 days to remedy the situation or face fines. Michael took the letter, went to his garage, and began the process of cleaning up. He raked out the trampled grass. He attempted to reseed the areas that had been destroyed. He took down the remaining pieces of streamer. He power washed the fence. By evening, his hands were blistered and his back ached, and he looked out at a yard that still looked like a disaster. That's when the emails started. They came in waves, ostensibly from people in the neighborhood, though Michael suspected at least half of them were from the same couple of people using fake email addresses. "You're a sociopath," one said. "Have you considered that your anger issues might be a sign you need therapy?" said another. "My kids are scared of you now," read a third, which felt particularly cruel because Michael had never been anything but kind to kids in the neighborhood before all this. There was a thread on the neighborhood Facebook page that had somehow accumulated 847 comments. Michael made the mistake of reading it. The narrative had solidified. Michael was a selfish, bitter man who couldn't handle people enjoying themselves. Corinne was a kind, generous woman who'd been attacked for trying to bring the neighborhood together. The sprinkler incident had become proof of Michael's fundamental selfishness. Everything he'd done in the past 3 years, being quiet, not hosting parties, keeping to himself, was reinterpreted as evidence of his antisocial nature. Someone had even found his LinkedIn profile and left a comment. "I see you work in project management. I hope you treat your team better than you treat your neighbors." His company had a social media team. He wondered how long it would take before they saw that comment and decided it reflected poorly on the organization. By the second week, Corinne had filed a restraining order. Not against him, she was too smart for that. Against him and his dangerous sprinkler system, claiming that she was in fear for her safety and the safety of other neighbors. The order stated that Michael was to disable the automatic irrigation system and have it inspected by a city official to ensure it was operating within safe parameters. Derek called him with the news. "It's going to happen whether you like it or not," Derek said. "The judge is going to approve it. I'd recommend you just have the system inspected yourself, prove it's fine, and move on. Fighting this is going to cost you more money and more time." Michael had the system inspected. A city inspector came out, ran through all 8 zones, checked the pressure settings, and signed off that everything was operating well within safety parameters. He seemed almost amused by the whole thing, making a comment about people being dramatic when the real issue was a trespassing dispute. It didn't matter. The restraining order was issued anyway. By the end of the second week, Michael had stopped leaving his house except for work and necessary errands. He couldn't go to the grocery store without seeing someone from the neighborhood who would pointedly ignore him, or, worse, look at him with such judgment that he could feel it burning across the produce section. His coworkers had definitely seen the Facebook posts. He could tell by the way they suddenly became very careful around him, asking him how he was doing in that therapeutic way that meant they'd been talking about him. On a Friday evening, exactly 2 weeks after the party, Michael stood in his backyard and looked at the damage. The grass was still patchy. The fence still bore marks from where the streamers had been. The meditation bench remained in a box in his garage because installing it felt like admitting that he'd given up on this space ever being the sanctuary he'd intended. He thought about Derek's words, "Pride costs a lot more than compromise." Michael picked up his phone and called Derek. "I want to settle," he said. "How much were you thinking?" "Whatever gets this over with." "I'll reach out to Patricia Stiles. I'd guess we can get it down to $10,000. Michael agreed, transferred the money the next day, and had the settlement signed by Monday morning. It didn't feel like winning. It felt like paying rent to people who had stolen from him, and then watching them spend the money on something nice while the neighborhood patted them on the back for graciously accepting his apology. But at least it was over. By the third week after the settlement, Michael had convinced himself that things would return to normal. He would fix his yard. The neighborhood would eventually stop caring. Time would do what it always does and move everyone forward to the next crisis, the next scandal, the next shared outrage. He was almost right. Things did start to return to a kind of normal. It was just a different normal than he'd expected. The first sign came when he received a notice from the HOA that his membership fee was being increased by 40%. The reasoning was vague, something about increased operational costs and community safety measures, but the timing made the message clear. They were punishing him, slowly and officially. Michael called the HOA president, a man named Richard Paulson who ran a luxury car dealership and had the confidence of someone who'd never been told no in his life. "The increase is standard," Richard said when Michael questioned it. "We have a meeting every year where we assess the needs of the community. This is the first increase in 3 years, and it's 40%. That's not standard. As I said, we're assessing current needs. The cost of living increases. Insurance rates go up. It's all part of running a community." Michael knew he wasn't going to get anywhere. Richard had already made his decision, probably over wine with Corinne, probably framed as necessary protection for the other residents. The second sign came when Michael's car was keyed in his own driveway. He found it one morning, long, deliberate scratches running down both sides, scratching through the paint to the metal underneath. It was professional work, done with care and probably with keys, definitely intentional. Michael filed a police report, but the officer who came out made it clear that unless he had video footage of who'd done it, there was nothing they could do. He didn't have video footage. He'd never seen the need for security cameras in a nice neighborhood. The third sign came in the form of a text from David, the neighbor from 2 streets over who'd texted his disapproval after the sprinkler incident. "Hey, I'm sorry about before. I didn't know the full story. Drink sometime." Michael's first instinct was to ignore it, but something in him wanted human connection desperately enough that he agreed to a drink. They met at a bar about 20 minutes from the neighborhood, and David bought him a beer and told him something that made Michael's stomach turn. "Corinne's been telling people that you had a history of being inappropriate with her," David said quietly, glancing around as if they were discussing state secrets. "Not like sexually inappropriate, but like boundary violations. She says you've been watching her house, taking pictures, trying to get close to her since her divorce." Michael stared at him. "That's completely made up." "I know that," David said quickly. "I mean, I figured it was. That's why I wanted to meet you, to tell you that I don't believe her. But you should know people are buying it. The version of events that's going around now is that you had some kind of stalker obsession with her, and the pool party was just the excuse you needed to retaliate." "How did that where did that come from?" "I don't know exactly, but I think she's been talking to her lawyer and her therapist about it. And you know how that goes. Tell the same story enough times, add a little emphasis in the right places, and people start believing it's true. Especially when the original incident already made you look bad." Michael felt something crumble inside him. "I'm not a stalker, David. I've barely spoken to her outside of a couple of hellos across the fence." "I know, that's why I'm telling you." David ordered another beer. "Look, I'm not going to lie to you. The neighborhood has pretty much decided you're the bad guy in this situation. Corinne's been very good at positioning herself as a victim. And she's sympathetic. She's a woman going through divorce problems, trying to build community, and you're this angry guy who attacked her with a water system. It doesn't matter what the actual truth is. What matters is the story people want to tell themselves." After David left, Michael sat alone in his car in the parking lot for 2 hours, trying to process that his life had been rewritten by someone else's narrative. The next day, he found a new kind of evidence of that rewriting. He'd been tagged in a Facebook post by someone he didn't know, a woman who claimed to be Corinne's therapist's friend. So definitely a connection you could trust, describing her concerns about a potentially unsafe neighbor. The post was framed in that carefully concerned language that made concern sound like certainty. "I'm not one to gossip, but I'm genuinely worried for people's safety. And I've been hearing stories that make me very uncomfortable. And I think the authorities should probably look into this situation more carefully." The post had 203 likes and 118 comments, almost all of them variations on support for Corinne and concern about Michael. Michael reported it for harassment. Facebook took it down within an hour, but not before he'd seen his name mentioned 47 times in the comments. He went to work the next day and found that his boss wanted to talk to him. "There's been a concern raised about your conduct," she said carefully, "and the company's HR department wants to have a conversation about your social media presence." "What concern?" "Someone from your neighborhood contacted us. They were concerned about comments you've been making in neighborhood forums that seem aggressive and potentially threatening." "I haven't made any comments. I've been staying completely silent." "I know that," his boss said gently. "And we believe you. But you can see why we have to take these things seriously. Just be careful out there. Maybe you want to stay off social media for a little while." Michael went home, disabled his Facebook account, set his Instagram to private, and tried not to think about the fact that his reputation was being systematically destroyed by someone with more time and less scruples than he had. By the 4th week after the settlement, he'd started to notice something else. Corinne was building something. She was documented in a series of neighborhood social media posts, hosting dinner parties, organizing book clubs, starting a neighborhood watch initiative. And in every one of these posts, there would be some kind of reference, usually oblique but sometimes not, to safety and boundaries and people who didn't respect the community. She was inoculating herself against future criticism by positioning herself as the caretaker, the protector, the person trying to hold things together in the face of disorder. It was brilliant in a deeply disturbing way. Michael realized that Karen wasn't trying to convince people that he'd done something worse than he had. She was reframing the entire incident so that his action wasn't a response to her violation. Her violation was irrelevant. What mattered was that he'd responded with aggression, and that made him the threat. The fact that she'd started the conflict didn't matter. The fact that he'd been violated didn't matter. What mattered was that he'd proven himself capable of violence, and violence was what people feared, and fear was what gave her power. By the 5th week, Michael started having panic attacks. Nothing major, just his chest tightening randomly, his breath becoming shallow, the feeling that the world was caving in. He'd wake up at 3 a.m. thinking about all the ways this could get worse. What if she accused him of something sexual? What if she lied convincingly enough that it went to actual police? What if she took it further, pressed charges, ruined him in a way that his reputation couldn't come back from? He called Derek in the middle of the night, in one of these panic spirals, and Derek actually answered, which told Michael something about his own paranoia levels. "I need to move," Michael said. "I need to leave the neighborhood." "Why? The lawsuit is settled. The restraining order is moot." "She's destroying my reputation. She's telling people I'm a stalker, that I have anger problems, that I'm a threat." "Let her, you know it's not true. The people who matter will know it's not true." "Will they?" Michael heard his own voice rising. "Because from where I'm sitting, nobody knows that. They all just know the story she's telling, and she's telling it better than I am." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Michael, do you want my advice? Sell the house. Move somewhere else. Start over. Because you're right. You can't win against someone like Karen in a reputation war. She's too good at it, and you've already lost the narrative. The only way forward is to create distance." "That's bullshit," Michael said. "I did nothing wrong." "I know," Derek said quietly. "But the world isn't fair, and you can't beat people like her by arguing logic or truth. You have to just remove yourself from the board." After they hung up, Michael stood at his bedroom window and looked out at his yard. The grass had mostly recovered. The fence looked fine. It was a nice property, the kind of place he'd dreamed of owning. And now it had become a cage, a constant reminder of the moment he'd lost control, of the way a single moment could be leveraged into an entire narrative that destroyed his peace. He called a realtor the next morning. "I want to sell," he told them. "As is, I don't care if I have to take a loss." "Do you want to fix it up first? It might help with the price." "No, I just want it gone." The realtor listed it the next day with a price that was $35,000 below what Michael had paid for it 3 years ago. It sold within 2 weeks, to someone from out of state who didn't know the neighborhood's history and didn't care about the scratches on the fence, or the patchy grass, or the fact that the previous owner had been a social pariah. Michael found an apartment across town, a temporary one, a furnished place that came with no history, no expectations, no version of himself that people had already decided he was. On his last day in the house, he drove past Karen's property. She was in her front yard with a group of neighbors, all of them laughing, all of them completely unaware that his car was passing. Karen looked happy, genuinely happy, the way someone looks when they've won something they desperately needed to win. 3 months into his new life across town, Michael received a phone call. It came at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday from a number he didn't recognize. He was in the middle of a project management meeting when it came through, and he almost didn't answer it. But the caller ID said Police Department, and something in his chest went cold. "Mr. Chen," a woman's voice, official and tired. "This is Detective Sarah Morales with the Suburban Police Department. I'm calling about some reports that have been made regarding your former address and your former neighbor, Karen Whitmore." Michael's mouth went dry. "What kind of reports?" "I'm going to need to come talk to you in person. Can you make yourself available tomorrow morning?" "Am I in trouble?" "Can you make yourself available?" "Yes, but what is this about?" "We'll discuss it tomorrow," the detective said and hung up. Michael spent that entire evening in a state of hysterical panic. His mind ran through worst-case scenarios. Karen had accused him of something. She'd gone to the police with some fabricated story, some lie that had been refined and perfected over months. He was going to be arrested. He was going to be convicted based on her word against his. His life was going to be destroyed. Detective Morales showed up at his apartment at 9 a.m. the next day. She was a woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and the kind of exhausted patience that came from hearing too many lies from too many people. She brought a younger officer with her, and they both sat on his IKEA furniture and looked at him like they were trying to figure out if he was a threat. "I need to ask you some questions about your former neighbor, Corinne Whitmore," Detective Morales said, pulling out a small notebook. "Did she press charges?" Michael's voice came out as a croak. "Just answer the questions. When was the last time you had contact with Corinne Whitmore?" "The day of the party. She came to my door afterward." "And after that?" "Never, we never spoke again." "You didn't text her, call her?" "No, I had my lawyer handle the settlement." Detective Morales exchanged a glance with the younger officer. "Mr. Chen, are you aware that Corinne Whitmore filed a report saying you sent her threatening messages?" Michael's stomach dropped. "That's a lie." "Do you have text records?" "Yes, my phone has every message I've ever sent. I didn't send her anything." "Can I see your phone?" Michael handed it over immediately, opened his messaging apps, and showed her that his only communications with Corinne had been verbal on the day of the party. Nothing after that. No threats, no messages at all. Detective Morales looked at the phone for a long time. Then she handed it back. "Mr. Chen, I'm going to be honest with you. This is not the first complaint we've received about Corinne Whitmore." Michael felt something shift in his chest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we've been getting calls about her for the past several months. Stalking allegations against 3 different men in your neighborhood. Property damage claims against 2 of them. A civil lawsuit against another. And in all of those cases, the men have shown us communications records proving that either the alleged harassment didn't happen or that they were being misrepresented." "So why are you here?" Michael asked slowly. "Because the latest complaint she filed, the one about you, is part of a pattern, and because I think you should know what that pattern looks like." Detective Morales spent the next hour walking Michael through Corinne's history. There had been a boyfriend, apparently, someone she'd dated for about 6 months during her divorce recovery. Things had ended badly, and she'd accused him of stalking and harassment. The case didn't go anywhere because the evidence didn't support it, but it cost the man significant legal fees and reputation damage. After that, there had been a neighbor who'd asked her to keep her dog from running into his yard. That had become a campaign about how unsafe his house was, how he was hostile to animals, how he probably had other behavior problems. His home had been egged. His tires had been slashed. Someone had left dead fish on his doorstep. He'd eventually moved. Then there was a man from her gym who'd politely declined to go on a date with her. Corinne had told people he'd been inappropriate with her, had made suggestive comments, had made her feel unsafe. His membership had been revoked after other women came forward with similar stories, all of which, Detective Morales said, they had no way to corroborate. "She's very good at it," Detective Morales said. "She identifies someone, frames herself as the victim, tells a compelling story, and watches as everyone else does her fighting for her. Men don't want to be accused of being predators or stalkers, so they often capitulate or leave rather than fight. It's actually a very effective strategy from a certain kind of predatory perspective." "So what are you telling me?" Michael asked. "I'm telling you that you're not her first victim, and you probably won't be her last. I'm also telling you that without actual evidence, messages, photos, something concrete, there's nothing we can do about her accusations. But I wanted you to know that she's done this before, that you're not alone, and that she's going to keep doing this until someone presses charges against her for harassment or defamation or one of the actual crimes she's committing." After Detective Morales left, Michael sat on his IKEA couch and tried to process what he'd just learned. He'd thought the war was over. He thought that by leaving, by walking away, he'd ended it. But Corinne's destruction of his life hadn't been something unique to him. It had been part of a systematic pattern, a kind of predatory behavior that she'd perfected against multiple men over the course of what was apparently years. He'd been so focused on his own victimhood that he hadn't stopped to think about the idea that victimhood was her currency, that it was how she moved through the world, that she'd make him the villain because that was the only way she knew to survive. Michael called Derek that afternoon. "I need to file a defamation suit," he said. Derek made a noise that was somewhere between a sigh and a groan. "Michael, no. She lied about me to the police. She's been telling people I'm a stalker, that I've been violating her privacy, all of it false. And apparently this is something she does, some kind of pattern of behavior. I need to go after her. You need to not do that, Derek said firmly. Here's why. Defamation suits are expensive, they take years, and they require you to prove not just that she lied about you, but that she did so with specific intent to harm you. They're nightmares. You'll spend $50,000 in legal fees for a case that might result in a judgment that she can't pay anyway. Is that what you want? I want her to face consequences. Then let the police handle it. Apparently they're already aware of her. If she continues this pattern, maybe someone else will eventually press charges. But you, Michael, you need to move on. How am I supposed to move on? She's ruined my reputation in the neighborhood. She's made me look like the bad guy when she's the one who violated my space. And now you're thinking about violating hers with lawsuits and legal action. Do you see the cycle? Derek's voice was gentler now. She took something from you, and you want to take something from her to make it even. But it doesn't work that way. It just creates more victims, and sometimes you're surprised to discover that you're not as innocent as you thought. After they hung up, Michael sat with that idea. He thought about the day he'd activated the sprinkler system. He'd done it deliberately, knowing it would cause damage, knowing it would humiliate her. He'd done it in a moment of rage and violation, and yes, he'd had every right to be angry. But he'd also made a choice. And that choice had given Karen exactly what she needed to paint him as the villain. She was predatory, obviously. She was someone who manipulated situations and rewrote narratives to always position herself as the victim. But he wasn't innocent either. His action had been aggressive. It had been calculated to cause emotional harm. It had crossed the line from self-defense into retaliation. And she'd seen that the moment he did it. She'd probably been waiting for something exactly like it, because a moment of his aggression was worth more to her than years of his reasonable boundaries. Michael didn't file the defamation suit. Instead, he did something quieter. He reached out to the other men, the ones Detective Morales had mentioned. He found two of them through social media, and he told them what he knew. One of them was relieved to finally know he wasn't alone. The other was angry and wanted to press charges together. They contacted Detective Morales, and there was a conversation about whether they had enough to build a case. Apparently, they didn't. Not yet. But the detective said she'd keep their reports on file, that if Karen did something to someone else, that pattern would be useful. It wasn't justice, it wasn't even close to justice, but it was something. And so Michael moved on. He got a promotion at work. He met someone at a coffee shop who didn't know anything about his past, and they started dating. He found a therapist who helped him understand that he wasn't a bad person for having boundaries, that defending those boundaries was different from violating someone else's, and that sometimes the world was unfair in ways that couldn't be fixed. He didn't think about Karen very often, but every once in a while he'd wonder what she was doing, if she'd found another target, if the neighborhood was still buying her stories, if she'd ever actually face real consequences for what she'd done. 6 months after Detective Morales' visit, Michael received an email from a lawyer he'd never heard of. It was brief and to the point. Karen Whitmore had filed for bankruptcy. She'd been sued by someone, another man from her gym, apparently, for defamation and emotional distress. The case had actually gone to trial, and the jury had found against her. The judgment was $180,000. She couldn't pay it. Her assets were seized. Her house was in foreclosure. She was leaving the neighborhood, moving somewhere else to start over, probably to do the exact same thing to someone else in a different community. Michael read the email 3 times, trying to feel something. Vindication, relief, closure. What he felt instead was tired. Because Karen's downfall didn't change what had happened to him. It didn't repair his reputation, or undo the settlement he'd paid, or bring back the life he'd had before that perfect spring morning, when he'd heard bass music, and looked out his window to find his boundaries being violated. Karen had taken something from him, and he'd taken something from himself trying to even the score. The neighborhood newsletter came to Michael's new apartment by accident, forwarded by the new owners of his old house. He was going to throw it away, but something made him open it. There was a long letter from Richard Paulson, the HOA president, about recent changes in neighborhood leadership and the importance of maintaining community standards while respecting all residents' safety and privacy. A new neighbor had moved in, apparently, and had called for Karen's removal from the HOA. The letter implied there was some kind of conflict, some kind of serious issues with how community decisions had been made. It was vague, but the message was clear. The neighborhood had turned on Karen once it became clear that her version of events was less reliable than everyone had assumed. Michael almost felt bad for her, almost. Instead, what he felt was a kind of resignation. The cycle would continue. Karen would move. She'd find a new neighborhood. She'd establish herself as a community builder, a connector, someone trying to heal from a difficult divorce. And then, eventually, someone would push back, and she'd find a way to make herself the victim of that pushback, and the whole thing would happen again with different names and the same essential shape. Unless she changed. Unless she learned something about herself and the way she moved through the world, and decided that violating boundaries wasn't actually the path to connection. Michael didn't think that was going to happen. People like Karen didn't usually change because they never really believed they'd done anything wrong in the first place. They believed they were always the heroes of their own stories, always justified, always right. It took someone with the kind of self-awareness that Karen clearly lacked to look at their own behavior and actually change it. A year after everything happened, Michael's therapist asked him if there was something he wanted to say to Karen. Not actually say, this was a visualization exercise, but something he wanted to articulate as part of his healing. Michael sat with that for a long time. I want her to know that what she did wasn't okay, he said finally. That violating my space and then lying about me to make me the villain was a real choice she made, not something that just happened to her. And I want her to know that I know she'll probably do this to someone else, and that's sad, not because I feel bad for her, but because it means she'll never actually have the kind of real community and connection she kept talking about. And what do you want to say for yourself? The therapist asked. Michael was quiet for a long time. I want to know that what I did, the sprinkler system, the escalation, wasn't who I wanted to be. It was a reaction to a violation, but it was still a choice. And I want to be someone who makes better choices. Not because Karen deserves my civility, but because I deserve to be someone I can respect. The therapist nodded. And are you someone you can respect? I'm getting there, Michael said. I'm trying. And that, he realized, was really all anyone could do. You couldn't control what other people did, couldn't force them to take responsibility or change or recognize the harm they'd caused. You could only decide who you wanted to be and then actually be that person, every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Michael moved on, actually genuinely moved on. He and the woman he'd met at the coffee shop, her name was Sarah, got more serious. He transferred to a different office in his company. He started volunteering at a community center, helping kids with their homework, something he'd never done before, but something that felt like it mattered. He didn't think about Karen. Well, he did sometimes, but not the way he used to. Not in that obsessive, circular way where he replayed the moments and imagined different outcomes and tried to figure out what he could have done differently to make it all come out better. Instead, he thought about her the way you might think about a hurricane after it's passed, with a kind of clinical acknowledgement that it had happened, that it had done damage, and that you were slowly rebuilding in its aftermath. 2 years after the sprinkler incident, Michael bought a new house. It was smaller than his old one, in a different neighborhood, with a much simpler yard that he didn't obsess over quite as much. He did install a sprinkler system. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah helped him plant a small garden. They set up a meditation bench that actually matched the aesthetic of the space, very different from the one he'd ordered in his old life. They invited his new neighbors over for a small gathering, nothing too big, nothing too loud, just a simple connection with people who didn't know anything about his past. One of the neighbors mentioned that they had a community book club and asked if Michael wanted to join. He almost declined out of instinct. He'd had enough of community involvement to last him a while, but Sarah nudged him and he said yes. The book club was fine. The people were nice. Nobody made him the villain, and nobody treated him like he owed them anything. It was just normal. And Michael had learned the hard way to appreciate normal. Sarah got pregnant, a daughter. They named her Emma. Michael found himself thinking, as he rocked her in his arms at 3 in the morning, about boundaries and violation and the kind of world he wanted to raise her in. He wanted her to know that no one had the right to her space, her time, her comfort, without her permission. He wanted her to understand that saying no was a complete sentence and that she didn't have to justify it or explain it or make other people comfortable with her refusal. And he wanted her to know that when she did say no, When she did enforce a boundary, she was still a good person. That protecting herself wasn't the same as being selfish. He wanted her to be stronger than he'd been, clearer than he'd been, less willing to assume other people's good intentions when their actions showed otherwise. When Emma was about 3 years old, Michael was at the grocery store and ran into Derek, his old lawyer. Derek was surprised to see him, surprised by how well he looked. "You seem happy," Derek said. "I am," Michael said, and meant it. "I'm actually happy." "That's good. You deserved better than what happened." "Yeah," Michael agreed. "I did. But I also made some choices that I'm not proud of, and I've learned something from all of it, so maybe it wasn't entirely wasted." Derek smiled. That's a healthy way to look at it. After they said goodbye, Michael continued his shopping, and he thought about what he'd said. Had the sprinkler incident been worth it, in the end? Had violating Karen's physical safety and comfort been justified by her violation of his property and boundaries? He didn't think so. Not really. Two wrongs had made a situation worse, not better. His aggression had given her exactly the ammunition she needed to convince everyone that he was the real problem, not her violation in the first place. But he'd learned from it. He'd learned that boundaries weren't about punishment or revenge. They were about protecting yourself. And that was a lesson worth some pain, some loss, some humiliation. When Emma was 7, her school sent home a notice about bullying prevention. Michael read through the materials, all the standard stuff about how to recognize bullying, how to help your child if they were being bullied, how to help them if they were the bully. One section talked about how sometimes kids misunderstood boundaries as aggression. How sometimes a child would feel violated and respond in a way that was disproportionate, and then that disproportionate response would define how everyone saw the child, not the original violation. Michael thought about that a lot. He also thought about Karen. He wondered if she'd ever become self-aware enough to understand what she'd been doing. He wondered if she'd ever looked back on her life and felt genuine remorse for the way she'd treated people, or if she was still somewhere in some other neighborhood, telling the same stories from the same victim perspective. He hoped for the sake of whatever community she'd landed in that she'd changed, but he wasn't counting on it. The last time Michael thought about the day of the sprinkler incident was about 10 years later, when Emma came home from school upset because another kid had taken her toy without asking, and she'd responded by pushing him down. "I was just protecting what was mine," Emma said defensively when Michael asked her about it. Michael sat down with her and tried to explain the difference between protecting yourself and escalating a conflict. He told her that the other kid was wrong to take her toy, but that her response had made things worse, not better. That sometimes when people violate us, the temptation is to do something we'll regret in the name of defending ourselves. "But didn't they deserve it?" Emma asked. "Maybe," Michael said, "but that doesn't mean your reaction was good. It doesn't mean it was the right thing to do. Lots of people deserve consequences. That doesn't make it your job to give them those consequences. Sometimes the right thing to do is just to protect yourself and then let other people or systems handle the rest." "That's not fair," Emma said, which was the most 7-year-old response possible. "No," Michael agreed. "It's not fair. But life often isn't, and fairness doesn't usually come from escalation. It comes from clarity about what you will and won't accept, and then following through on that without trying to also be the one who punishes people for crossing you." Emma didn't look entirely convinced, but she seemed to absorb the lesson. After she went to bed, Michael sat with Sarah and told her the story. All of it. The party, the sprinklers, Karen's lies, the siege of his reputation, the lawsuits, the whole catastrophic spiral. Sarah had known some of it, but not all of it, not the way Michael had lived it internally. "Do you regret it?" she asked when he finished. Michael considered the question carefully. "I regret the escalation. I regret the aggression. I regret giving her the weapon she needed to destroy my reputation." He paused. "But I don't regret the boundary. I don't regret telling her that, no, you can't throw a party in my yard without asking. I just regret the way I enforced it." "Would you do anything differently if you could go back?" "I'd ask her to leave. I'd tell her the party was over and everyone had to go. I'd be calm and firm about it. And I'd call the police if she refused, and I'd let the actual system handle the violation instead of trying to handle it myself." "That's very mature," Sarah said gently. "It's took me a long time to figure it out," Michael said. "And it cost me a lot to learn, but yeah, I think that's the right answer." He thought about Karen sometimes, even years later. He wondered if she ever thought about him. He wondered if she'd ever understood what she'd done, or if, in her narrative, Michael remained the villain who'd attacked her with water for no reason other than his own selfishness and anger. It didn't really matter. Karen's version of the story didn't change what had actually happened. It didn't change Michael's memory of that spring morning or the way the violation of his boundaries had fundamentally changed how he moved through the world. But he'd built a good life since then. A better life, maybe, than the one he'd been building before. One that was more intentional, more grounded in actual values rather than just the pursuit of a perfect lawn. Sometimes, when Emma was working on a science project or learning about cause and effect, Michael thought about that moment when he'd pressed the button on the sprinkler system. About how one action had cascaded into so many consequences, ripples spreading out in directions he'd never anticipated, touching people he'd never meant to hurt. It was a lesson about power in a way, about the difference between having the right to do something and it actually being right to do it, about the way that even when you're defending yourself, when you're in the right, you can still make choices that you'll regret. Karen had violated his boundaries, and that violation had been real and had deserved some kind of response. But the response he'd chosen had made him into something he didn't want to be, if only for a moment, if only in that 45 seconds of spray and chaos. That was the part that stuck with him, not Karen's actions, which she owned entirely and which said nothing about Michael's character, but his own response, which had revealed something about what he was capable of, about how quickly he could shift from defending to attacking when he was angry enough. It was humbling. It was important to remember. And it was the reason he tried to model something different for Emma, tried to show her what it looked like to have strong boundaries without needing to weaponize them, what it looked like to protect yourself without needing to hurt anyone else in the process. Karen had taught him what not to do by example, and he supposed that was its own kind of lesson, its own kind of value, even if it had cost him dearly to learn. 20 years after the day of the party, Michael was at Emma's college graduation. She was studying to be a therapist, of all things, and she told him that she was inspired partly by seeing her father navigate trauma and actually come out of it stronger and wiser rather than bitter and vindictive. Michael had cried when she said that, not because he wanted credit for handling things well, he hadn't, not initially, but because she'd seen the hard work of the years after and understood that growth wasn't about never making mistakes. It was about what you did with the mistakes once you'd made them. As he watched Emma walk across the stage to receive her diploma, Michael thought back to that spring morning when his life had fundamentally changed direction. He thought about the choice he'd made in anger, the consequences that had followed, the long process of building himself into someone he could respect. He thought about Karen somewhere, living her life, probably still violating boundaries and still reframing herself as a victim. He hoped, genuinely hoped, that someone had eventually called her out in a way that stuck. He hoped she'd felt something like what he'd felt and that it had changed her. But he wasn't counting on it, and he didn't need it to happen for his own peace to be complete. Michael had learned the hard way that justice wasn't always going to come from the world doing what it should do. Sometimes justice was just you moving forward anyway, living well anyway, becoming someone good anyway, despite everything that had happened.